One.
Well, hello, you good people. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to Peikoff Wednesdays. I am once again honored to join James Valliant for a discussion of Leonard Peikoff's writing. And you know, we're working our way through this massive tome, keeping it real, bringing ideas down to earth. And this week, James, you have selected Questions from the Edge. We just got past the elections, although results are still coming in. So some things are iffy.
Yeah, some things are very much still up in the air.
And given some of the issues, and of course, abortion at the forefront, but quite a few issues, the culture war comes to the fore.
Very much so. Very, very much so. And I know today's topic is very controversial, not just in our society at large these days, but among the objectivists and Ayn Rand fans. So let's take it on and do the best we can in what is obviously an explosive issue. I know people have very intense feelings about it, but sexual identity is a major issue of the 21st century. And objectivism has some very interesting things. I mean, obviously, objectivism is a philosophy. It doesn't enter areas like psychology proper, which this issue raises. On the other hand, objectivism has some very important guidance here that may give us some clues on how to understand the issue.
And you think objectivists would need this? Now, I thought objectivists, we were all A is A, and men are men and women are women, and it's all very simple. Men don't have long hair and drink espresso and wear pink shirts.
Well, one man that I admire highly does. And
I joke about it, but I've actually watched friendships blow up over do men wear pink shirts between objectivists. So yes, we're going to deal obviously with a little more substance than that, but we're going to touch on all of it.
Does it really come down to pink? Wow.
It's complicated. So I'm going to jump right into question number one, because of the four questions you've picked, we could easily spend a whole hour on this. So we'll see how it goes.
True.
Leonard Peikoff was asked, in a previous podcast, you said it was wrong to go against nature by undergoing a sex change operation, and that the metaphysically given is an absolute. But by this definition, gender is not metaphysically given because we can now change it if we choose. Now, before I go into Dr. Peikoff's answer, a bit of smuggling in there, this idea that, well, because so many people say you can change your gender, and so many people appear to do that, that our questioners, oh, well, we can do that now. Wasn't that kind of smuggling in the answer you wanted?
Amazing, right? If someone had said, well, now we can change into birds, now we can change into fish or orangutans, someone was, obviously, we do not possess the capacity to transform into another species, but apparently another physical and genetic gender is something this guy thinks is doable in our lifetimes. Interesting.
I saw a guy glue on wings and he was playing Icarus, but that means we can become birds. Now, let me give Dr. Peikoff's answer, but I want to talk to you about this because, well, let me jump right in, because Leonard Peikoff said, I reiterate that the nature of man is immutable. Of course, there are freaks in every species, but you don't define the nature of a species by reference to freaks. You cannot change the sexuality of a person. You cannot change a woman into a man, and vice versa, no matter what hormones and what surgeries. Well, they end up lacking certain crucial capacities of either sex. The best example of this is to see what kind of sex lives they live and what kind of pleasurable experiences they can get. From what I can tell and from what I've read, well, they simply mimic the sex act because they don't have the pleasure part connected to the nervous system. Nature does give us an either or metaphysical absolute. Well, if you say, oh, I don't like nature's choice, I want to be the other sex. Well, you are rebelling against nature, against reality. If that were true, that by some kind of magic, you could take a man and transform him into a woman. Well, I couldn't oppose that, but there is no such magic. We're talking about in reality. All you can do in reality is destroy, remove, and mutilate. thinking of this as rebelling against reality, there are exact parallels to the sex change. Somebody just sent me an article. Again, this is Leonard Peikoff. Somebody just sent me an article describing some parents who have had a child. They won't release whether it's male or female. And they've decided to bring the child up in such a way that the child has no idea which gender he is. And he will choose when he reaches maturity which way he wants to be. You know, it's a parallel to people who don't say anything about religion or atheism. And then when the child reaches 18, they just say, okay, you study and pick. But in this case, what do they have to do to keep him ignorant of what is, in fact, an absolute? Will they conceal his or her genitalia? Or teach that it doesn't really matter and that it's got nothing to do with their sexuality? You can't remove the organ because, well, what if that's the way the kid chooses? Are they going to have to give the child the same clothes or opposite clothes? Are they going to promote 50% dolls and 50% machine guns? And he then makes the comparison to Elian Gonzalez. The kid was brought up by those parents. They sent him back to would have a worse, the parents who wouldn't tell the kid their gender will have a worse life than being brought up under a communist dictatorship. And ending the quote, to me, that example is horrific. I can't even imagine, even if it's not a matter of trying to literally stop the kid from seeing his own genitals, to bring somebody up with that floating uncertainty, that lack of identity, that lack of absolutism.
Well,
can you imagine?
No, that's gross child abuse in my view. Look, the concept boy-girl is, recently we had a Supreme Court nominee who was asked by a senator during the confirmation process, she's now a member of the United States Supreme Court, if she could define the concept woman. And her response was, no, she could not, because she did not have a degree in biology.
Yes.
I strongly disagree. The concept boy-girl, that distinction is a relatively first-order, low-level, perceptually given concept. Toddlers have no problem, even before without seeing genitals, toddlers have no problem making the distinction between boys and girls, men and women, from a perceptual level based on the physical differences. Humans obviously normally come in two varieties, male and female, and the physical differences are perceptual, relatively concrete physical differences that can be identified and conceptually separated by a toddler. I think one has to go to Harvard, probably Harvard Graduate School, to begin to get confused on that as a first order, or at least a low level concept that toddlers can quickly come to directly from sense perception. The next thing I think we need to analyze there, and one of the most controversial aspects of Dr. Peikoff's statement there that caused much consternation, but I must say within the objectivist world and without, was his use of the word freak.
Yeah, came across a little harsh.
It came across to very, I remember at the time, I had arguments with people at the time online when Dr. Peikoff made this statement. It contains a negative evaluation that some people found offensive, but I do not think Dr. Peikoff was being there uncompassionate to people who have a psychological condition where they're uncomfortable in their own body. But let me put some flesh on what Peikoff was saying. Look, if a person does experience what is technically called body dysphoria, discomfort in the body that they find themselves in, I feel like a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body, that cannot be regarded as a healthy condition. In fact, for those who say that, look, it requires surgical correction, only a severe pathological condition would justify surgical correction. So if you are not willing to admit that this is a pathological condition, like an appendix that's been infected, and therefore, we say, look, this is an unhealthy case. I don't think we're really qualified to enter the debate. That being said, and I think that's all Dr. Peikoff was saying here, look, if you're not comfortable in the body you're born in, if you're so uncomfortable that you need some kind of medical treatment, drugs or surgery, then obviously we're talking about a pathological condition. And whether it hurts people's feelings or not, it has to be said out loud. But look, if I have appendicitis, it's not a moral issue. And similarly, transgenderism is not, like any other psychological condition, not a moral issue. I do not believe Dr. Peikoff was saying, do not be compassionate for those who have experienced body dysphoria. What he's saying is that it is abnormal. And that's all he meant by the term freak. He was also indicating there that we simply do not have the capacity to wave a magic wand and change people easily from one to the other. When Dr. Peikoff made his comments, I also looked up some of the science, what little science we have on it, in fact. The large numbers of people who get the surgery and regret it are significant. The large numbers of much higher than normal suicide rates. And I know people say, well, it's the social atmosphere that is part of the higher suicide and depression rates. But is it that alone? Are we certain of that? Especially with the high degree of regret and want to undo the surgery? And we're going to cut to a question later about circumcision. If circumcision, if my dear leftist friends, circumcision is not something we should impose on a child, then how on earth can we impose physical changes on a child with regard to their very gender before the age of consent, or even cases before puberty? That now becomes, in my mind, an outrageous moral issue. I know I was just very controversial there in what I said, so maybe I'll just leave it there. But the fact of the matter is, if we're not willing to admit that extreme body dysphoria and that transgenderism in general is not a psychological problem, that is to say, whether it's neurological in cause or environmental in cause or cognitive in cause, it really doesn't matter. It is a psychological condition that is pathological. It requires treatment. It is an unfortunate, painful condition to experience body dysphoria. If we don't admit that, if we try and pretend that it's normal and that, oh, well, yeah, and every time a girl acts like a tomboy, she's obviously in line for being transgender, then we've crossed, in my mind, a very disturbing line. And I have to agree with Dr. Peikoff.
Good. Well, eventually we will get to not what are counterexamples, but what is context, because you and I both have known transgender individuals. And in fact, and it will come as a surprise to some, but not if you've been watching the ARCUK, there are transgender individuals within Objectivism. And I believe one of them was interviewed on the ARCUK. But before we go to there, I've got to say thank you to Jonathan Honig, who is in the super chat. Thank you for that. Very much appreciate it. And Bonnie, we love Bonnie Bertrand. It was in the super chat as well. Thank you for that as well. If y'all want, I know that people listening and watching this have strong thoughts, feelings, opinions on the subject, some of which are just feelings they can't control, and they're just stuck with them for life, and they're going to have to modify themselves to get along with them. Please put in a super chat and support us. Ask any questions you've got, get on board. Any super chats you put in, support the Ayn Rand Center UK. And with a challenging topic like this, that's an especially good time to
I want to say
let us know what you think.
Yeah, please do let us know. Obviously, we're talking about something that's very controversial, something that Ayn Rand did not discuss herself, something that it obviously involves technical scientific issues like, medical science, biology, as well as psychology that are not objectivism. Objectivism does not have a position on medicine. It does not have a position on psychology. Objectivism is a philosophy. And these are obviously questions that are moral questions that are connected to those other sciences and depend on our answers to that. And you bring up a really good point. There are multiple people within Objectivism who are transgender. And I have to say, one of my dearest friends this year passed away. And perhaps people on Facebook, where I'm very active, knew him, Andrew Bergman. And there was an objectivist who understood the nature of the situation. He had never any problem identifying himself privately as a biological female. He was opposed, for example, to transgender women participating in female athletics. He thought that was the death of female athletics. He never went through a sex change operation. He thought the better path for his happiness, acknowledging he had a condition. He never went through the sex change surgery, although, you know, that's an issue in itself, which is, again, not directly a philosophical question because it's connected to so many scientific questions about which there are many unknowns. But it didn't change anything about his being an objectivist. It didn't change my ability to value him for his virtues and to acknowledge him the way he wanted to be acknowledged. Just not comfortable from the time he could remember being a female. And that is a condition that he had to live with and work with. And unfortunately, psychological science could not answer the question for him. And since it could not answer the question for him, as with many psychological or medical conditions, we live with it. Does that end our compassion for these people? Absolutely not. Does that make it impossible for them to lead virtuous lives as objectivists? Absolutely not. Do we not treat people, call people what they want to be called, and treat them in a compassionate way? Absolutely not. And we can do that without denying the physical facts of reality. That is the wider context that I would really urge even the fiercest objectivists on this ASA side of things to consider. All of us have a context. All of us have psychologies. All of us have aspects to our psychology that we either can't change or aren't worth changing. And that's just called being a human being.
I couldn't agree more. And it's almost frustrating that more people can't simply accept facts, accept reality. We may say it's unfortunate that Leonard Peikoff chose the word freaks. I don't think he was putting the weight on it that we do. He was simply pointing out, this is not normal. This is not the normal outcome. Chromosomes operate a certain way. Sexuality functions a certain way. This is not the way these things work. But sometimes that happens.
Just saying body dysphoria is a condition is controversial.
Yes.
How, why should that be? That's utterly bizarre. It would be like saying to someone else, your social anxiety is not a psychological condition. Well, of course it is.
Yes.
It's interfering with your happiness. If you're miserable in the skin you find yourself in, that's not a healthy, normal condition. Sorry.
Yeah. And I think the up in arms culture war aspects of this are so unnecessary.
Unnecessary. Because in effect, I love the title. I wasn't chosen by me. I did select these questions, but the title wasn't selected by you. You guys chose this title, and it's a wonderful one. We are what we is. But that not only applies to us physically, it applies to our psychology and those aspects of our psychology, which we cannot easily change as well. We are what we is. And this is true physically, but it's also true psychologically about certain things about ourselves. And both have to be acknowledged. Both have to be acknowledged with understanding, and when there is a condition, with compassion. Yes. I mean, we don't treat someone with a physical ailment as though they're a morally depraved human being. I see no reason why we should treat people with psychological conditions the same way. Lord knows I have all manner of psychological conditions. This is not one of them. But we all do. And I don't expect to be, socially ostracized because, say, I have a fear of heights. Let me just make up something like that. Just because I can't, stand on the roof of a skyscraper without getting sweaty palms doesn't mean I should be morally ostracized or morally condemned. There are no emotional shoulds. Psychological conditions are not subject to moral evaluation. And that's the distinction I would draw. I would have to say to my leftist friends, look, acknowledge it's a condition. It's not a happy, healthy situation. I would say to my conservative friends, it's not a moral issue either. These people cannot change who they are psychologically any more than they can change physically, at least at this stage in science. maybe science will change one day, and we can do a lot more, but we are nowhere near that state right now, either psychologically or physiologically, in our ability to truly change things.
Yes,
that's the best way I have of putting it.
Yes, I see it's so much of it is reaction. The people, not our friends on the left, but the extreme left, the people who are causing this problem in the culture war, are reacting to years and years of, first, of course, by race and by gender, but then eventually by sexuality. And here I mean homosexuals. The way in which such people were treated, not as a norm, but on the fringe, was bad. It was just bad. And they're reacting to that. And they're seeing their...
People were put in prison. People were, before that, executed.
In the Middle East, they still are.
According to the Bible, you execute homosexuals.
But the left...
Yeah, said the Mosaic Law, and Christians picked that up and did it for centuries. They executed gays. Yes. Even just 140 years ago or something, 30 years ago, about Oscar Wilde, the great writer, the brilliant humorist and playwright and novelist. Oscar Wilde was put in prison for being a homosexual. That is barbaric. That is evil. And to the extent that we treat transgenders, of course, even worse through history, my God, surely that we can afford some compassion for a virtuous person who finds themselves in a condition that even if we think it's a condition. Now, with homosexuality, I have to say, it's hard for me to even identify it as a pathological condition or a psychological illness. My God, I have seen gay couples, both male couples and female couples, who appeared to be happy, healthy, romantic, fulfilled lives. They appear to be worked out psychologically, have happier, longer-term relationships than many straight people I know. So in that situation, it's hard for me to even identify that as a pathological condition. They seem to be comfortable in their bodies, and they appear to have achieved happiness in their romantic lives. If there's I apologize for understating what our homosexual friends have been through. All you need to do is watch the recent film about Alan Turing, The Imitation Game. Any of these stories are just infuriating and depressing. But the only point I was making was that not our friends, but our extremists on the left, look at all of that, and their reaction is to say things that make no sense whatsoever. Because we've got to go all the way in, I shouldn't even say the other direction, but in an obscene direction. And it started with, transgender restrooms and went into transgenders in sports, and they're ruining whole aspects but it's the same thing we see with the actual reactionaries, what we call, the extreme right, who then see all of that. And do they come in with a rational, compelling, fully understood, context sensitive? No, they're just, all of this is bad. They're all bad. They forget completely the individuals. They don't care about anybody suffering from the transgenderism, from body dysphoria. They don't care about individuals. They don't even see individuals. All they see is the fight, the war, the culture war. We've got to fight because of the left. And the left, of course, has been saying, well, we've got to fight because the right. And that's why I have so much respect for people we've known, 10, 15 years ago in the homosexual community, and now in the transgender community, people who don't react blindly in rage or anger. I have to say here that objectivism, whether Ayn Rand intended it or not, whether Dr. Peikoff intended it or not, objectivism has psychologically saved the lives of both homosexuals and transgenders I have known. It helped them understand, navigate being yourself, being an individual, thinking for yourself, defining what is in your self-interest and what your long-term happiness requires. Objectivism has been a huge aid to people, many people I know over the decades in both of these regards. Stuart Wade Margolis, who's worked for the Ayn Rand Institute. He wrote an article about his own experience on this a while back. I urge people
brilliant,
to read that
article.
And frankly, I hope to do something like that for my late friend Andrew, the equivalent of that, to show how objectivism really helped save his life and helped give him a happy life. Navigating, thinking for yourself, feeling for yourself, being yourself in a hostile world. Objectivism has a whole lot to offer people who find themselves in this situation, in fact.
Just so. Superficial readings of objectivism may not reveal that, but I can absolutely say that the answer to these largely unnecessary conflicts are to be found in respect for reality and the use of reason. And I don't know any better way to put that into practice than this philosophy. And since we're talking about the superpowers of objectivism, we've got a super chat from Bradley for €5.99, and he has a slightly unrelated question, but again, superpowers of objectivism, he says, is the superpower of objectivism that it helps one use reason to understand the limits of the actual power others have over us? Well, that would, we might have to save that for the end, because that gets into the whole, we never had to take any of it seriously, and the impotence of evil. The short answer I would give Bradley is yes. It's one of them, one of those superpowers. Me too. It is one of the superpowers. It's more than that. It's also the egoism part. It's also the self-esteem part. It's the independence part. These are vital. These are vital parts of being who you are in this world where you've got religious people who have a dogmatic, idea of the way things should be. And if it doesn't follow that, well, into prison or worse, they go, or social prison, at least they go. Or the leftist who says, well, ignore the body dysphoria part, treat them as though they're perfectly healthy and there's no problem here at all. And we're going to ignore all that and pretend that people who've been through puberty as males are females when it comes to, say, female sports. That's just an outrageous evasion of facts. Just as outrageous an evasion of facts as our religious friends over here, who are ignoring the psychological reality that many people do live with. Outstanding. Let me get to question 2. Wait a minute. Question 2. We're half an hour in and we're only on question 2. I knew this was going to be a good and important discussion. And we're not done yet, because Leonard Peikoff was asked, well, does a person have free will in regard to his or her sexual identity? Now, before I read some of the question, Leonard Peikoff took it essentially as sexual preference in this context of this question, but it's going to apply. Right. He said, well, generally, I would say no, because your sexual identity is the result of basic premises, accepted unknowingly when you're very young, and accepted implicitly as generalizations about yourself, the opposite sex, and the world. As such, those are not chosen by will. They are impressions that go into your subconscious without your awareness. At a certain point, they then issue a certain type of sexuality, such as being straight or gay. Now, neither of those was chosen in the normal meaning of the term. Nobody can say that, well, when they were young, one day they said, well, I'm going to be straight, or I'm going to be gay. That is a consequence of complex premises. It is not subject to will. Now, you could ask, doesn't the mind choose all its ideas? Well, the answer is yes, but you may well have innocent errors that are beyond your power to detect at the time. That is always a possibility. And a little bit later, he says, but don't you have free will as an adult to unearth your errors, change your mistakes, and change your sexuality? Sorry, I laugh a little bit because it's a reasonable question. People ask this kind of thing, but Leonard Peikoff says, I think that can be done in some cases, but for the most part, by everything I've seen, psychology is simply not advanced enough to enable a person to do it. Not today. That's absolutely correct. And and he goes on, I believe, to say that where he has seen people allegedly change from gay to straight or straight to gay, these were probably bisexual people all along, a phenomenon that has gone totally widely unrecognized, the extent of bisexualism. Neither side wants to acknowledge that because it works against them.
because it works. Strangely, it works against them. You're absolutely correct there. But what he says there about sexual preference is surely true about sexual identity in the deeper sense here as well. You know, when I discovered where babies came from and how sex takes place, it was, I remember as a child, the moment, it came as a total revelation, a total surprise to me. What goes where? You mean that? That's where babies are coming? What?
I still don't get it.
As I said, I still don't get it. But as a small child, there's no instinct for how to make babies or how to have sex. I had to learn it. It was a discovery, like everything else for human beings. And it was a surprise to me. But by that time, even when I was a small child in elementary school learning the birds and the bees, by that time, I had already formed all kinds of evaluations, psychological impressions about what boys and girls are, my relationship to that. Am I a boy? Am I a girl? Or what are boys to me? What are girls to me? I'd already had a whole concept of what boys and girls are. I'd already developed attachment patterns, either healthy ones or unhealthy ones, with my caregivers as a toddler. So already I've developed the framework for all kinds of psychological evaluative cognitions, even before I've learned where babies come from. By the time we get there, much less by the time we get to puberty and our sex drives are really kicking in, we already have a complex psychology, one that psychology is just now, if at all, really beginning to understand how it gets formed. So I would urge everybody, when it comes to these kind of issues, to step back and stop being a moralist. People have conditions which are either impossible or let me include what we call cisgenderism, heterosexuality. It's a condition you probably can't change or change easily. So why would you? And we should start treating everybody's sexuality that way. It is not a chosen phenomenon. And once more, let me repeat, emotions are not subject to moral evaluation. Psychological conditions are not subject to evaluation. I would refer you to Ayn Rand's seminal, trenchant article, The Psychology of Psychologizing.
Outstanding. Yeah, that's hard to beat in that regard. No. I'm a complete armchair psychologist, and I can tell what's going on with those people. Yes, an outstanding article. So it gets more complicated because we talked about, well, what about transgenderism in women's sports? But that's almost easy as the transgender bathrooms was. Well, we'll have some bathrooms that are acknowledged to be for people who don't want one or the other bathroom. And nowadays, so many of them are unisex. Sports will be harder, but if you want a really hard question, let's go to number 3.
Yeah.
Well, what right does a parent have to alter a child's body? On one end of the spectrum, I can imagine a parent wanting to remove an abnormal but benign growth, like, say, a 6th finger. Don't do that. The Princess Bride wouldn't make any sense without that. Sorry.
No, that was
the other
reference there.
You can never go wrong with a Princess Bride reference. On the other end of the spectrum is circumcision, which I regard as mutilation. This is still the questioner. Aside from these two extremes, somewhere in the middle of the spectrum are things like ear piercing, on which I am still undecided. That example to me is interesting. Well, at least Leonard Peikoff's answer to it is interesting. He says, well, by the way, I agree 100% that there can be no legitimate reason to circumcise a boy. It's either primitive religion, abject conformity, which I think it is in most cases, or the evil of destructiveness.
Yeah.
I had to go through that. My kid's going to go through that. I want to be normal like me. Yes. So, Dr. Peikoff.
Twisted monster who first came up with the idea, even in their heads, of mutilating a baby's genitals. I mean,
it's so hard to keep clean. Let's just cut it off.
Yeah. Yeah. No, obviously circumcision is mutilation. You don't remove the body part from a child before the age of consent I mean, can you imagine removing a healthy eye or a healthy earlobe? I mean, my God, you leave the child intact. But if it's an unhealthy growth, if there's a pathological condition, right? Obviously, you're
Yes.
going to remove a cancerous growth or a sixth finger, which is probably going to interfere with the other ones in most cases. Most of these genetic, and I'll use Peikoff's word, genetically freakish conditions are unhealthy. They're either fingers that the sixth finger gets in the way or makes the other ones, and surgery is usually required to correct the use of the hand. Now, in those conditions, or even if it's just an abnormal growth, I mean, you want to get rid of it. It's unhealthy. It's unnecessary. The body parts that we come with, including foreskins, by the way, should be left on the child. Look, if we don't let children sign contracts because they're below the age of consent, if we believe that someone under the age of 16 is too young to consent to sex, and we make it a serious crime when adults have sex with someone under 16 because they're under the age of consent, then doing something to your child against their will that permanently affects their lives should be considered child abuse, just as if the parent was chopping off a healthy finger, in my view. I have very, very strong feelings about this. Only can justify this kind of nonsense. Now, as I say, if our liberal friends are joining us on that point and understand that circumcision is mutilation, then consider the physical alteration of children. Think about it, the physical alteration of children at or before puberty, before they've even developed, much less reached the age of consent. Children go through phases. Children are still working things out. Just because a girl goes through a extended tomboy phase should not have one leaping to the conclusion that maybe she's born in the wrong body and she's experiencing severe body dysphoria. And she may go through a period where she doesn't know. What we need to do is leave kids alone to go through their own development, and let them reach an age of consent where they can actually make these permanent decisions about their body. It's their body. Whether we regard sex change operations as a good idea or not, only adults should be allowed to do it to their own bodies, not anyone to a child's body. That is child abuse, physical child abuse of a serious kind, in my view.
And you make a great point. We talk about, we want to respect what the child is going through. If you have any respect for your baby boy, you don't cut off 1/5 of his penis. Well, if you have any respect for your children of any age, you don't allow them to have entire body parts cut off or hormonally cut off, essentially. Yes.
No, I was barely, yes, of course, I had strong, as every teenage boy does, I had a strong sexual urge, but I was still working things out. I wasn't sure what all I was, who I was, what all my relationship to this whole thing called sex. It took me time to figure it out. And for adults of any sort, parents, doctors, and making these permanent physical changes to children before they reach the age of consent, before they've finished their physical development, just seems outrageous to me. Outrageous child abuse to me. It's just that simple. There's also the medical issue with doctors, frankly. I happen to think, if someone, and these are real cases, if someone came to a surgeon and said, look, I really have a hard time with my left leg. I don't like having a left leg. It bothers me. I identify as a one-legged pirate, let's say. And I really want you to surgically remove this healthy leg. Would it be moral for the surgeon to say, yeah, I will be happy to remove this healthy functioning organ? No, there's a medical ethical question here. And until we have the science on these things really cleared up on the matter, it would seem to me that a responsible surgeon would not remove a healthy leg. Now, I'll finish the story. There's a famous case of a man who asked doctors to remove his healthy leg, got no's from a couple of surgeons in the United States, went south of the border to Mexico, and was found dead, having tried to remove his own leg in a motel in Mexico. Now, what an ethical dilemma for a doctor. I appreciate both sides. He went and killed himself, in effect, because he couldn't get the surgery here. Would it have been better to remove the healthy leg and have him not commit suicide? Or should he have gotten psychiatric treatment that would have helped him here? So, of course, it's a complex matter, but
Sure.
it's ethical for a doctor to remove a healthy leg? The same ethics applies to sex change operations. And if you don't think that the same considerations are involved, I'd ask you to check your premises.
Yes, but you do respect the complexity there. You've got that fringe case. Of course, our friends on the left don't think it's a fringe case. No, this is happening all the time, of the suicidal child. The girl who is, for example, growing in a very full bosom, cannot live as a tomboy, and is suicidal because she doesn't regard herself as a woman, regards living as a woman to be an incredible threat, and she's just ready to off herself if she cannot have that. And again, I'm not saying the right thing to do is to let it happen. What I'm saying is it's not always a simple answer, and we need to be the ones who can acknowledge that.
Exactly.
And some of these cases are just ghastly, and there are no right answers. You've got people that talk about a case of body dysmorphia, or not dysmorphia, dysphoria. The case of the woman who identified as blind and ended up putting lye in her own eyes to blind herself. Well, you can't say that her problem was that she wasn't allowed to live as a blind person, or that she didn't have her eyes surgically removed instead of doing it herself. No, she had a psychological problem that made it impossible for her to live, or at least to live reasonably. That happens.
Identify, frankly and straightforwardly, is that she had a pathological psychological condition that caused her to destroy her healthy eyes.
Yes.
And if we can't say it that frankly, then we're not really addressing the issue. Now,
right.
Just, as simple in many, as you point out, it gets very complex in the transgender issue. I am not a medical doctor. I am not a psychiatrist. I do not, and I will not pretend to know what the correct medical treatment of certain individuals should be. Maybe it should be on a case-by-case basis. I am not prepared, because I do not know the science on this, to lay down what the diagnoses and treatment should always be, or that they should always be uniformly the same. But I think we do have to recognize, as Dr. Peikoff does, that this is not a healthy, normal situation. That has to be a premise. And people sort of have to get over that, even if it feels like you're hurting someone's feelings. But you're not hurting anyone's feelings any more than if you're saying they need an appendectomy.
Yes. And the execution is difficult, but the principles are simple. Incidentally, I didn't read the rest of Dr. Peikoff's answer. Let me give just a bit of that. He says, my view of the broader issue here would be this: if there is no violation of the biologically normal, well, then the parent may make changes. He may make changes in that which is abnormal, or that which is required for health. For instance, I do not think parents have the right to withhold blood transfusions in the case of a child who would sicken and die from the lack. That should be absolutely mandatory. Well, we know, the Christian Scientists or Jehovah's Witnesses have substantial restrictions on what they'll let their kids receive for medical care. Leonard Peikoff goes on, aside from this, and this might be controversial, I think, especially given some of the chat going on. Aside from this, I think that anything else that would be permanent should be forbidden by the parent until the child is 18. For instance, piercing ears, to wear earrings, piercing the tongue, having indelible tattoos, all of that, I think, should be prohibited by a parent. It's permissible for a parent to do, it's permissible for a parent to do that. Oh, prohibited by the parent. So it's the parents can prohibit all of that. Their child is their ward and doesn't know well enough what to do. And then he says, well, that's a pretty old-fashioned view, but it's definitely mine. Taking it as far as earrings, what do you think about that?
Well, I think the important issue here is the consent of the person themselves. And when we create a legal age of consent, Dr. Peikoff has said, look, we do this based on an average, and it's somewhat arbitrary. We draw a line in the sand at 18.
Sure.
Now, there are some 14-year-olds, in my view, who are more competent to vote than many 30-year-olds I know. So people mature and develop at different levels, and the question is, has the young person, in my mind, achieved enough mental competency and maturity to make a decision about the permanent state of their body? surely legally at the point of 18, they have that right, and there's nothing the parent can do to stop them. But if I were a parent, say, of a child between the ages, say, of 14 and 18, I would monitor the child on an individual basis. And if the boy or the girl wanted to pierce their ear, I would say, look, that's a relatively minor thing. And even if you regret it later, it's going to be this teeny little hole in your earlobe that people will only notice if they look close. So I would probably, when it came to, say, pierced ears, let a mature teenager make that decision for themselves. But I think minor cases like that even should be on a case-by-case basis. Will your 14-year-old, is he or she mature enough that they probably won't regret it, or at least be able to live with it like an adult would be able to live with their decisions of that kind? The question is my kid still going through a phase, and next week they'll regret it, like going through some, I'm into, gangsta rap or something when I'm 13. Will the kid outgrow some phase like that? That's the way I'd look at it when it comes to minor, rather superficial physical changes. But I have to agree with the principle. Permanent physical changes are of a category where it's the consent of the person whose body it is that's all important. And if they haven't reached the age of consent on that, no one has any business permanently affecting their body until they've reached that age of consent.
Yes. I have to admit, I think, for example, with ear piercing, there is or should be a way either to get parental consent for that. No, I think that may be the only way. But there are people who don't have regular parents or regular family situation, in which case you should be able to petition the court. And it shouldn't be, I want to go to court to get pierced ears. It should be a very simple form that you would fill out. But I love that you're pointing out something.
That's probably, yeah.
You're pointing out something that, again, some of us find challenging, which is, in order to make a legal system objective, you have to set a reasonable standard. And then what makes it objective? The fact that you chose it. And now we all know that the age of majority is 18. And within this context, wasn't that arbitrary? Isn't that subjective? No, that is how law has to work, is you set a reasonable standard, tell everybody what that is, and that makes it objective. And I think you could do something like that with procedures like piercing ears. It could be set to 14 with parental consent. I think we already do that in a lot of states, and that seems reasonable to me.
Right.
And but then we could get into the really complex issue of teenagers seeking abortion. 16-year-old girls whose parents forbid it, for example. Then it gets complicated. And that's, fortunately, we're not doing that show today.
Yeah, no, we're not doing that show today. But I think idea of that, if her parents are for purely religious reasons preventing a 16 or 17-year-old from getting an abortion, I'm afraid I'm going to probably start leaning on the girl's side, even though she hasn't reached 18. It's her body. And that's what we have to keep returning to. Whose body is it? And if they've reached an age of reasonable consent on that point, they are the ones fully in charge of their body. And that's the way it has to be.
Yes. Let me go to Super Chat real quick here, because we've got a couple of them. Kindred Amy, I think I know who that is, says, well, if you're facing a major life change, gender, sex, weight, etc., be sure your foundation about your relationship with reality and yourself is rational. Okay, now we're not talking about kids here. Change of body will not fix everything. Good show. Well, thank you, Kindred Amy. She's in for $9.99, so I've got to give her props right there. I think I know that person. I've seen that name before.
Amy makes a wonderful point there. Look, there's only so much I can do. Look, if I'm not feeling terrific self-esteem about my looks, I can go, I can work out, I can get myself in better physical shape, I can get a facelift or dye my hair or something. Whatever I can do to make myself look better, do that. Make yourself feel better about yourself. But there's only so much maybe you can do. How about that?
Yes.
You know, I have to live, I look in the mirror every morning and I look at my face. No, I'm not an actor or a model. But guess what? I have all these other values to my life. I've been able to learn to live with this mug of mine, whatever I think about it. It's not
I think you and I are pretty good looking, but I think Amy's right. Our relationship to reality is what makes us attractive.
It's relationship to reality. Just accept the facts and work to some extent with what you got and what you can't change. You have to do that at some level. That's where ASA kicks in, both physically and psychologically.
And we have one more super chat, not to be outdone with Amy's $9.99. Emmanuel is in with $10 and says, such a great show. James is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. So there you go, James. Yet another person besides me recognizes you are the man.
Well, thank you, sir. Wow.
Yes,
Blown
thank
away.
you, Emmanuel. I appreciate that. And finally, I'm going to do the fourth question, even though I don't want to run over, but this will go quick because it sums up, I think it shows a question that sums up what we're talking about here. Leonard Peikoff was asked, do you think psychological problems can hinder or prevent someone from living according to objectivism, such as by undercutting the confidence that would be needed to live in this way? And Leonard Peikoff answers, do this real quick so we can talk about it. I would say such problems can hinder you, but I don't think they would prevent you. You still have enough choice as to what you do. But how easily and naturally you do it is a different question. You might have the kind of problem, for instance, depression, that makes it very difficult for you to act and gives you a tremendous sense of inertia. You might have a lot of anxiety, making it hard for you to disagree with people. You may have a defense mechanism of hostility, making you immediately suspicious and antagonistic, even though you know it's improper. In other words, your psychology can affect your motivation and the defense mechanisms that you've automatized. And you can know about those and still act in accordance with your views. To do it seriously, however, you have to deal with your psychology. And then the questioner went on, is there a way to get around this obstacle other than by solving your psychological problems? And Leonard wraps up by saying, oh, I don't know of any. At the least, you'd have to solve your basic psychological problems, the ones that are really undercutting your motivation and your confidence. You don't know how to do that except by dealing with it. Probably if they're that significant, through a therapist. I think, unquote, I think we're at a point where there is respect for psychology. I think CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, helped with that a lot.
Yes.
Nowadays, everybody's calling it dialectic behavioral therapy. I still haven't found out the difference. But the kind of work that the better psychologists, people in psychology, starting with Ed Locke and Ellen Kenner, and now we've got Gina Gorlin, and we've got so many good people in psychology that I think there's great respect for the field in objectivism. You know, that crazy Brandon guy didn't do us any favors in that regard early on.
No, but the truth is that objectivist psychologists have been pioneers in the field of what is called generally cognitive behavioral psychology or humanist psychology, generally speaking, in the school of Maslow and so forth. And Rogers, Maslow, even Albert Ellis that Nathaniel Branden debated in the 1960s, that general school of philosophy that says, our thinking has an impact on our feeling and our emotions. If there's some emotion that's making you really unhappy, making it difficult for you to cope with life, then you need to address it for your own well-being's sake, for your own selfishness sake. And there's really only one way to do that, and that's by looking in, trying to identify the cause, the etiology, and oftentimes it's deep in our childhood, either over a long period of time in our childhood or from some traumatic event in our life. And if we don't address those issues, we're just going to continue to be unhappy or unable to function and cope. If it's getting to that point, you need to address it. And if there are certain things you can't change about yourself that you just certainly have to live with, well, look, this is an aspect of my self-esteem. Let's divorce it from sexual identity altogether. Say this is an aspect of my self-esteem that makes me feel this way. And so when I'm on dates with women, I just have to understand this about myself and cope with it as best as I can. It may just be a permanent feature of my personality. I'll hope to find a woman who finds it cute and adorable that I have this quirk. But the point is, we're all individuals. We all have contexts. We all have, and I don't mean to say that we're all flawed, because we're not all morally flawed. Moral perfection is possible, but we all have psychologies. We all had mothers. We all had contexts. We all have personalities, some parts of which are rooted deeply in our childhood, maybe even our toddlerhood or infancy. And we have to just live with those in some cases. And when we're fixing the problem, sometimes we can only address it so much even. But we have to accept who we are for what we are. And when it comes to psychology, recognize it's not a moral issue. We can be compassionate and understanding of people with their emotional and psychological issues, starting with ourselves. You know, a lot of people beat themselves up about their own neuroses or anxiety or depression or something. You know, they can't get along with people, and so what they do is they'll project out a hostility at everyone who's got psychological problems, as if it were a moral problem. But psychological issues are not moral issues. And that's the thing that I would come down on hard on this point here. Even if we, I think, have to acknowledge that body dysphoria is a pathological psychological condition. On the other hand, that doesn't mean they can't be good objectivists, the most moral, honest, rational people dealing with their context as best they can, because they sure can be. I have known, some most virtuous people I've known have been transgender. Some of the people who've understood and tried to enact objectivism in their life with the greatest degree of integrity have been transgender.
Yes, and have handled their relationships with others with such grace, and patience, and rationality.
Yes, yes, and without any evasion of the facts, a recognition of all of the facts, both physical and psychological, and that's what we have to do. There's no reason to not be compassionate to someone who's going through this and having to make these difficult decisions. But I think it raises a whole host of ethical issues, both medical ethical issues, as well as issues especially pertaining to children, that I think most people don't want to address in a rational, principled way these days. We need, and philosophy alone can help give us guidance here.
The right answers in this case are hard to fit in a tweet. You really need a philosophy of reason to deal with the most challenging subjects. And you're right. We've seen, again, it started with our friends in the gay and lesbian community. Now our friends in the transsexual community. These are the folks I see dealing with these issues the way they should be dealt with. Not reactionary like the fringe left and not reactionary like the fringe right. Never forgetting that A, reality comes first, and B, the individuals are what matter.
Heroes to me. I'm going to say it. Heroes to me.
Yes.
No.
Outstanding. James, this is a difficult subject, and I will reiterate what Emmanuel in the chat said. You are the GOAT. You bring the wisdom every time. We talked a little bit about, before the show, we talked about kind of Buddhism and Eastern philosophy and the idea that some of the later Buddhists who got away from the really woo stuff and said, you know, your aspiration should be you are the Buddha. And to me, taking all the woo out of it means you're the first-hand thinker. You're thinking for yourself. And if there's any subject in which thinking for yourself and not reacting to the left and not reacting, fighting the left when you have to, fighting the right when you have to, but not just reacting, but thinking firsthand, it's an issue like this. And so it's an honor to see you doing this for us, James, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much. This is a complex and difficult subject. And I'm blown away by these comments. But, you know, philosophy does help us here with the answers. And what's wrong to do is to apply psychology to morality in our thinking, or morality to psychology in our thinking. I just ask us to back up and show compassion for people with whatever their condition is and whatever their context is, if it's not their choice. On the other hand, we need to acknowledge that that doesn't excuse, no psychological condition excuses anyone, you know, short of a psychotic, literally someone who's hearing voices and needs to be, you know, locked up. Short of that, no psychological condition stops us from requiring us to develop a moral character, from being rational, honest, and having integrity, and considering these issues in a principled way. That none of us can avoid doing, whatever our psychological context.
Outstanding. You have delimited it perfectly. folks should go read The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made and realize that their own psychology, even though it is man-made in a sense, by the time you're an adult, there's also a sense in which it really is metaphysical. And you still get to decide in any given moment, not what you feel, not your sense of it, but you get to decide what to do about it in any given moment.
Beautifully put, Robert. You are the master of your life. Yes.
And so it is. So I thank the people who have joined us. We had a lot of activity in the chat. I'm almost surprised because at the last minute, Yara and Brooke decided to do an election recap. And yet we had so many folks and super chats. Thank you for supporting the Ayn Rand Center UK. If you're not already, become a member. Become a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK. Go to aynrandcenter.co.uk. Click Become a Member at the top. Sign on. You can support the kind of shows that are going on. A link to the Daily Objective coming up in less than an hour was just posted in the chat by our producer. I will certainly be watching and listening to that. And in a week, we will do this all again on a whole different subject. We'll see if James will pick one as interesting, difficult, but important as this one. James, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, sir. That's a great discussion.
Excellent. Everybody have an outstanding afternoon. Join the Daily Objective shortly, and we will see you next week.